The Krillian hegemony had been crushing civilizations across the galaxy for over 10 years now. Their massive crystalline warships moved from system to system like a plague, and the results were always the same. Total victory. Complete domination. 17 different star systems had already fallen to their might, and each conquest had been easier than the last. The pattern was simple and predictable. The Krillians would show up with their gleaming fleet, broadcast their demand for unconditional surrender, and within hours, maybe days at most, another species would bow their heads and accept their fate. Some tried to fight back initially, sure, but it never lasted long. The technology gap was just too massive. The Krillian ships were like floating fortresses made of living crystal that could slice through enemy hulls like butter. Admiral Vextar had seen it all before. The desperate final stands, the frantic evacuation attempts, the pitiful last-ditch efforts to negotiate. After a while, it all started to blur together. Just another day at the office for the most feared military force in known space. So when his intelligence officers brought him reports of radio transmissions from a small blue planet in an unremarkable star system, Vextar barely looked up from his tactical displays. The planet's inhabitants called themselves humans, and from what the scouts had determined, they had only recently developed faster-than-light travel. Primitive stuff, really. Their ships looked like they were held together with spare parts and hope. Admiral, his second-in-command, ventured carefully, should we prepare the full invasion fleet for this? Earth. Vextar actually laughed. A full invasion fleet for a species that had just learned to travel between stars? It would be like using a plasma cannon to swat an insect. Complete overkill and a waste of valuable military resources that could be better used elsewhere. 3 dreadnoughts, he decided without much thought. Maybe 4 if you're feeling generous. These humans barely qualify as a spacefaring civilization. Will be done before the midday meal cycle. The decision made perfect sense from a strategic standpoint. Why commit massive resources to what was clearly going to be another routine conquest? The Krillian military machine was efficient above all else, and efficiency meant using just enough force to get the job done quickly and cleanly. But as Admiral Vextar's small task force dropped out of hyperspace near the 3rd planet of this unremarkable solar system, something immediately felt different. Wrong, even in all his years of conquest. Vextar had developed an instinct for how civilizations behave when faced with overwhelming force. There was a pattern, a rhythm to how species reacted to imminent destruction. First came the panic. Wild, uncontrolled radio chatter as governments and military leaders tried to figure out what was happening. Then the desperate attempt at communication, usually some variation of, "Who are you and what do you want?" Followed quickly by offers of negotiation, tribute, anything to avoid a fight. But Earth was quiet, not the silence of a dead world, but the focused quiet of a predator waiting in the shadows. The radio frequencies were active, but the communications were crisp, organized, military in nature. No panic, no begging, just cold, professional coordination that spoke of a species that had been preparing for this moment. On the bridge of humanity's flagship, a vessel the humans had boldly named the Defiance. Captain Jake Morrison stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the alien ships take up attack positions. His uniform was simple, practical, without the elaborate decorations that many species seem to favor for their military leaders. But there was something in his posture, in the way he carried himself, that suggested this was not a man who scared easily. Around him, his crew moved with practiced efficiency. No one was running around screaming about the end of the world. No one was abandoning their posts or demanding evacuation. Instead, they were checking weapon systems, coordinated with other ships in the small human fleet, and preparing for what everyone knew was going to be the fight of their lives. The communications officer, a young woman whose hands were steady despite the circumstances, looked up from her console with professional calm. "Sir, the alien vessels are transmitting what appears to be a surrender demand. Standard format, multiple languages. The usual threats about resistance being futile." Captain Morrison's response came without hesitation, delivered in a voice that carried clearly across the bridge and would soon echo across the galaxy. Tell him to come and take it. And in that moment, Admiral Vextar realized he might have made a serious miscalculation. The moment the first shots were fired, Everyone expected the same old story. The Krillians had done this dance countless times before, and it always ended the same way. A few minutes of token resistance, maybe some desperate last stands, and then complete surrender. Admiral Vextar was already planning his victory report when the human fleet opened fire. What happened in those first 3 minutes changed everything. The Krillian dreadnoughts unleashed their crystal beam weapons, and the results were exactly what everyone expected. 2 human vessels simply ceased to exist, vaporized so completely that not even debris remained. The crews aboard those ships never even had time to scream. One moment they were there, the next they were nothing but expanding clouds of superheated gas. But then something happened that no one saw coming. Lieutenant Amy Foster was piloting what used to be a simple asteroid mining vessel called the Iron Will. Her ship wasn't built for war. It was designed to crack rocks and haul, or nothing more. The weapons bolted onto its hull were improvised, cobbled together from spare parts and desperate engineering. By all reasonable standards, it should have been destroyed in the opening volley along with the others. Instead, Foster did something that defied logic. She pushed her mining vessel's engines past their safety limits, diving straight toward the nearest Krillian dreadnought at an angle that should have been suicide. The alien ship's defensive systems tracked her approach, charging up for what should have been an easy kill. But Foster wasn't flying in a straight line. She was weaving, spinning, using every trick she'd learned from years of navigating treacherous asteroid fields. The mining laser that had once cut through solid rock now focused its beam on a single point of the Krillian ship's crystal shield matrix. For exactly 2.3 seconds, that improvised weapon hammered the same spot with concentrated energy. And then something beautiful and terrible happened. A crack appeared. It was small at first, just a hairline fracture in what everyone believed to be an impenetrable barrier. But cracks have a tendency to spread, and as the crystal shield destabilized, sections of it began to flicker and fail. Did you see that? Foster's voice exploded across every communication channel, filled with a mixture of disbelief and wild excitement. These things can bleed. Those 4 words changed the entire battle. Suddenly, the darkness of space began to light up with engine flames as ships emerged from places that should have been empty. They came from behind asteroids, from the shadowed side of moons, from deep space positions that had been carefully plotted months in advance. The humans hadn't just been preparing for this fight. They had been planning it down to the smallest detail. What Admiral Vextar witnessed next challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. These weren't the actions of a primitive species, stumbling through their first real battle. This was coordination at a level that took most civilizations centuries to develop. A damaged human cruiser, its hull breached and life support failing, suddenly changed course and accelerated directly toward a Krillian destroyer. The alien crew probably thought it was a desperate escape attempt until the very last second, when they realized the human ship wasn't trying to flee. It was turning itself into a guided missile. Another human vessel, a converted cargo hauler that had no business being in a space battle, somehow managed to position itself perfectly to catch a Krillian ship in a crossfire between 2 other human vessels. The timing was so precise it seemed impossible, like they were reading each other's minds. But perhaps most shocking of all was how the humans treated their own damaged ships. In every other species the Krillians had conquered, damaged vessels would retreat, surrender, or at best try to limp away to fight another day. The humans did something different. They turned their dying ships into weapons. When a reactor was about to overload, instead of evacuating, human crews would steer their ships toward enemy targets and detonate at precisely the right moment for maximum damage. When weapon systems failed, they would ram their vessels into Krillian hulls with a precision that suggested they had practiced this maneuver. Admiral Vextar found himself staring at tactical displays that made no sense. His supposedly superior technology was being countered by human ingenuity at every turn. His overwhelming firepower advantage was being neutralized by human tactics that bordered on madness, but somehow worked perfectly. For the first time in over a decade of conquest, Admiral Vextar was actually having to think, really think, not just about how to crush an enemy quickly and efficiently, but about how to survive against opponents who seemed to have turned warfare itself into an art form. The humans were fighting like their lives depended on it, because they did. The battle was reaching its peak when Commander Rick Sullivan found himself in what should have been his final moments. His heavy cruiser, the Thunderbolt, had taken a direct hit from a Kryllian plasma cannon that tore through the ship's midsection like tissue paper. The damage reports flooding his command console painted a picture that any experienced captain would recognize immediately. His ship was dying. The main engines had been completely destroyed, leaving the Thunderbolt drifting helplessly through space. The weapon systems were offline, their power conduits severed by the same blast that had crippled the engines. Most critically, life support was failing rapidly. The atmospheric processors were stuttering, and the artificial gravity was fluctuating wildly. In less than 20 minutes, the ship would be nothing more than a metal coffin floating through the void. Standard military protocol was clear in situations like this. When a vessel suffered catastrophic damage with no hope of repair, the crew was to abandon ship immediately. Escape pods were designed specifically for this scenario, giving crews a chance to survive even when their ship could not. Any reasonable commander would have given the order to evacuate without hesitation. But Commander Sullivan was looking at something that changed his perspective entirely. Through the Thunderbolt's cracked viewports, he could see a Kryllian heavy cruiser positioning itself for another attack run. The alien vessel was massive, easily 3 times the size of his own ship, its crystalline hull gleaming with deadly beauty. Its weapons were charging up, preparing to finish off another human vessel that was already badly damaged. Sullivan made a decision that would echo across the galaxy. Instead of ordering his crew to the escape pods, he sent them there himself while he remained on the bridge. One by one, his officers and crew members evacuated, many of them reluctantly leaving their captain behind. But Sullivan had made his choice, and nothing was going to change his mind. Alone on the bridge of his dying ship, Sullivan took manual control of the navigation systems. The Thunderbolt might not have engines, but it still had maneuvering thrusters. Small ones, designed for docking procedures and minor course corrections, but they were enough for what he had in mind. Using every bit of his 20 years of spaceflight experience, Sullivan began to plot an intercept course. The math was incredibly complex, calculating the trajectory needed to bring his drifting ship into contact with a moving target, accounting for gravitational effects, momentum, and the limited thrust available from the maneuvering system. It was the kind of calculation that normally required computer and several minutes of processing time. Sullivan did it in his head in less than 30 seconds. As the Thunderbolt began its final journey, Sullivan opened a communication channel on all frequencies. His voice carried across the battlefield, reaching not just the ships engaged in combat, but somehow bouncing through subspace relay stations and communication networks throughout human space. "This is for every human who won't see tomorrow," he said, his words calm and steady despite the chaos around him. "This is for everyone back home who's counting on us to stand between them and the darkness." The Kryllian cruiser's crew probably realized what was happening in the final few seconds. Their ship's defensive systems tried to target the approaching human vessel, but the Thunderbolt was too close and moving too fast. Sullivan had timed everything perfectly. The collision was spectacular. The human cruiser struck the Kryllian vessel's engine section with devastating precision, and both ships' reactors went critical simultaneously. The explosion that followed was visible from every ship in the battle zone, a brilliant flash of light that temporarily blinded sensors across half the solar system. But Sullivan's sacrifice was more than just a tactical victory. In those final moments before impact, he had transmitted something that would change the course of the entire war. It wasn't a distress call begging for help. It wasn't a surrender message accepting defeat. It was something that struck at the heart of what it meant to be human. "Earth stands," his final transmission said simply. "Come home." Those 3 words somehow found their way through the galaxy's communication networks, reaching human colonies and outposts that were dozens of light years away from the battle. Mining stations on the edge of known space picked up the signal. Research facilities in distant star systems received the message. Even the generation ships that had been traveling between stars for decades somehow heard Sullivan's call. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, ships began changing course throughout human space. Cargo vessels, exploration ships, colony transports, even civilian craft that had no business in a war zone, all of them turned toward Earth. Admiral Vextar watched his tactical displays with growing alarm as more and more human ships appeared on long-range sensors. What should have been a simple 3-day conquest was rapidly becoming something he had never experienced before, a fair fight. For the first time in his military career, the Admiral began to wonder if he had bitten off more than he could chew. The message that Commander Sullivan had broadcast before his sacrifice spread through human space like wildfire. Within 48 hours, something unprecedented began happening across dozens of star systems. Ships that had been going about their normal business suddenly changed course, all heading toward the same destination, Earth. Captain Lisa Hayes had been 3 weeks into a routine colony supply run when Sullivan's transmission reached a convoy. She was hauling prefabricated housing modules, agricultural equipment, and medical supplies to a frontier settlement that desperately needed them. Any sensible person would have continued the mission, delivered the supplies, and stayed safely away from what was clearly a military disaster in the making. Instead, Hayes made a decision that her corporate bosses back on Mars would have called insane. She ordered her entire convoy to reverse course and head for Earth at maximum speed. But she didn't stop there. Hayes had spent 15 years running supplies to mining colonies, and she knew exactly what kind of equipment those operations used to cut through solid rock. Her convoy made an unscheduled stop at the Titan Industrial Complex, where Hayes used every favor she'd accumulated over her career to get her hands on military-grade mining lasers. These weren't toys. They were industrial tools designed to slice through asteroid cores like butter. Her engineering teams worked around the clock to mount them on the colony transport ships, turning peaceful cargo haulers into improvised warships. Dr. Tom Baker's arrival was even more dramatic. His research vessel, the Curiosity, had been conducting deep space experiments on something he called quantum disruption technology. The theoretical applications were fascinating, but Baker had never tested his inventions in actual combat conditions. When he heard Sullivan's call, he saw an opportunity to field test weapons that his own colleagues thought were too dangerous to use. Baker's ship looked harmless enough from the outside, just another scientific vessel with sensor arrays and research equipment. But hidden in its cargo holds were experimental weapons that pushed the boundaries of known physics. Energy disruptors that could destabilize matter at the molecular level. Gravity manipulators that could crush enemy ships like tin cans. Weapons so advanced that they probably shouldn't have existed yet. The most surprising arrival of all was Pete Johnson and his ancient freight hauler, the Lucky Strike. Johnson was 73 years old and should have been enjoying retirement on some peaceful colony world. His ship was so old that museums had newer models on display. The Lucky Strike had been hauling cargo between star systems for over 40 years, and it showed every day of that service. But appearances could be deceiving. Johnson had spent 4 decades learning every trick of space travel, and he'd made modifications to his ship that weren't in any official manual. Hidden weapon mounts that could be deployed in seconds. Armor plating disguised as cargo containers. An engine that could put out twice its rated power when Johnson needed it to. When the old freight captain showed up in Earth's orbit, his first action was to single-handedly destroy a Krillian destroyer that had been harassing human supply lines. The alien crew never saw it coming. Who would expect a threat for what looked like a harmless cargo ship? These were just 3 examples of hundreds of similar stories playing out across the solar system. Human ships kept arriving from everywhere, each one bringing its own unique capabilities to the fight. Some were military vessels that had been operating in distant sectors. Others were civilian craft that had been converted for war in shipyards throughout human space. What made this response so remarkable wasn't just the numbers. It was the attitude. Every single human who answered Sullivan's call came ready to fight to the death for something that went far beyond simple survival. They weren't just defending their home world. They were defending their right to exist as free beings in a hostile galaxy. The Krillians had faced desperate last stand before, but this was different. Other species fought hard when they were cornered, sure, but there was always a breaking point, a moment when survival instincts would overcome courage, and they would surrender rather than face extinction. The humans didn't seem to have that breaking point. Admiral Vextar watched his carefully planned conquest turn into a grinding war of attrition that stretched on for months. His ships were being slowly worn down by an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Human reinforcements kept arriving, human tactics kept evolving, and human determination never wavered. What disturbed the Admiral most was that the humans fought with genuine anger, not the panic of a corner animal, but the cold fury of a people who had been pushed too far and were finally pushing back. When the Krillian reinforcement fleet finally arrived at Earth, Admiral Vextar expected to find the aftermath of a completed conquest. His original 3 dreadnoughts should have been in orbit around a subdued planet, processing surrendered documents and cataloging new resources for hegemony. Instead, what he found when his massive fleet dropped out of hyperspace was something that defied every military manual ever written. The space around Earth looked like a graveyard of twisted metal and crystal. Debris from hundreds of destroyed ships floated in slow, deadly orbits around the blue planet. Both human and Krillian vessels had been reduced to wreckage, their hulls split open and their crews long dead. But for every destroyed human ship, there were pieces of Krillian vessels scattered among the ruins. What shocked Admiral Vextar most was what was still alive and fighting. His tactical displays showed thousands of human ships still active in Earth's orbital space. Not hundreds, thousands. The reinforcement fleet he'd brought consisted of 12 full battle groups, over 300 vessels that represented a significant portion of the hegemony's total military might. And somehow, they were outnumbered. The human ships came in every shape and size imaginable. Ancient cargo haulers flew alongside sleek military cruisers. Civilian passenger transports had been converted into missile platforms. Even small personal craft had been armed with whatever weapons their crews could find. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos that moved with a purpose that sent chills down Vextar's spine. Every single ship in that massive human fleet was crewed by people who had made the same decision. They would rather die fighting than live on their knees. There was no panic in their communications, no desperate pleas for mercy, no attempts at negotiation. Just cold, professional determination to make the aliens pay for every inch of space they tried to claim. The final battle that followed lasted 18 hours and became the bloodiest single engagement in galactic history. Human ships threw themselves at Krillian dreadnoughts with ferocity that bordered on madness. When their weapons failed, they used their ships as battering rams. When their engines died, they turned their reactors into bombs. When their hulls were breached and their crews were dying, they kept fighting until the very last moment. Admiral Vextar had commanded fleets in dozens of conquest campaigns, but he had never seen anything like this. The humans fought with coordination that suggested months of planning, but also with an improvisation that allowed them to adapt to any situation in real time. They used tactics that should have been impossible for such a young species to develop, yet executed them with the precision of veterans who had been fighting together for decades. As the battle raged on, something unprecedented happened in Krillian military history. Units began requesting permission to retreat. Ship captains who had never backed down from any enemy started reporting critical damage and asking to withdraw from the engagement. The mighty Krillian war machine was actually being ground down by an enemy they had initially dismissed as primitive. By the 15th hour of the battle, Admiral Vextar realized the unthinkable was about to happen. The Krillian hegemony was going to lose, not just suffer casualties or accept a costly victory, but actually lose a military engagement for the first time in their recorded history. His flagship, the Crystal Throne, was taking massive damage from coordinated human attacks. The ship's crystalline hull was cracking under repeated impacts, and critical systems were failing throughout the vessel. Around him, his command staff worked frantically to keep the ship operational, but Vextar could see the fear in their eyes. They all knew this battle was lost. As the Crystal Throne began its death spiral toward Earth's atmosphere, Admiral Vextar activated the ship's long-range communication system one final time. His message was broadcast directly back to the hegemony's ruling council, cutting through dozens of light years to reach the crystalline spires of the home world. "Mark this system as forbidden territory," Vextar said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "These humans are unlike any species we have ever encountered. They don't fight for territory or resources or conquest. They fight for something we cannot understand, something that makes defeat impossible for them to accept. That makes them the most dangerous enemy we could ever face." Captain Jake Morrison stood on what remained of the Defiance's bridge, watching through a cracked viewport as the last Krillian ships activated their hyperdrives and fled into the depths of space. His ship was barely holding together. Its hull breached in a dozen places, life support systems running on emergency power. Around him, his surviving crew members worked to keep their vessel operational despite damage that should have destroyed them hours ago. Earth hung below them, scarred by orbital bombardments, but still whole, still home. Millions of people had died in the fighting. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble, and the planet would bear the scars of this war for generations to come. But humanity had survived. More than that, they had won. The message that Earth's victory sent rippling through the galaxy was simple but profound. Humanity was here. They weren't going anywhere, and anyone who wanted to test their resolve had better be prepared for the fight of their lives. The age of human expansion was about to begin, and the galaxy would never be the same.